You stand in a room where the air itself feels alive, trembling with secrets. Silk rustles like whispers in the dark, and somewhere behind a velvet curtain, history prepares to breathe. You are not meant to be here, yet you cannot look away, because tonight, love and politics share the same bed, and the world is watching. Before we pull back those curtains, a word to the curious. Wherever you're watching from, Rome, Rio, or Reykjavik, take a moment to marvel at this strange fellowship we've built across centuries. People separated by oceans, now united by a single story of power, lust, and legacy. If you feel that pull of history too, leave a mark below, tell us your city, and join this gathering of time travelers. And of course, if you believe that the past still burns beneath the skin of the present, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay close. The year was 1502. Italy was not a nation, but a fever, an exquisite chaos of city-states stitched together by ambition and betrayal. The House of Borgia, towering above them all, had turned piety into politics. Pope Alexander VI ruled as both father and monarch, his daughter Lucrezia, his most valuable gambit. Twice married, twice widowed, she stood between reverence and ruin, a figure molded by rumor more than truth. Yet that winter night in Ferrara, she was not the scandal they imagined. She was a weapon waiting to be drawn. The great hall blazed with candlelight, each flame trembling against the mirrored armor of guards. Perfume and myrrh hung thick in the air, mixing with the faint smoke of torches. Courtiers feigned joy as they toasted the new alliance, but behind every smile lurked calculation. For this union, between Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este, was not a matter of love, but survival. And the true theater awaited above, in a chamber prepared like an altar for sacrifice. The bed was dressed in linen embroidered with the Este crest. Candles stood at mathematical intervals, their light cold as judgment. A narrow gallery overlooked the room, a place for witnesses, clerics, courtiers, even the Duke's sister, Isabella. In this world, privacy was weakness. A marriage unconsummated was a treaty unsigned. What unfolded would decide whether peace or blood would follow. Lucrezia entered first, her gown a river of white silk, her hair crowned with pearls that gleamed like captured moons. Her expression betrayed nothing, neither fear nor innocence. She had walked through too many corridors of whispers to be naive. Alfonso followed, tall, silent, a soldier molded by war. Their eyes met, not as strangers, but as players recognizing the same script. Outside, snow veiled the night in silence. Inside, breath fogged the air as the witnesses waited. Somewhere, a quill scraped parchment, ready to confirm that the union had been sealed. A priest murmured a benediction that sounded more like a verdict. And then, with a curt gesture, the curtains were drawn back. The act began, not of passion, but of politics. No one recorded the details, though many pretended to know them. The truth is simpler and more haunting. Every movement was deliberate, every sigh a signature. This was negotiation disguised as desire. For Lucrezia, it was the moment she ceased to be pawn and became architect. Each gesture was a clause, each breath a bargain. The audience witnessed a woman mastering the very theater meant to bind her. When it ended, the priest spoke two words that would echo through history. Legitimum est. It is legitimate. Outside, Ferrara's bells tolled, solemn and triumphant. The alliance had been forged. In the gallery, witnesses lowered their heads, already composing reports to their masters. Yet none of them saw the true transformation. Lucrezia's composure was no longer endurance. It was control. Later, when the hall had emptied and the ink dried, she sat awake in the flickering glow of dying candles. Her wedding ring, thin and golden, glimmered like a snare. Below her, music and laughter swelled, the hollow celebration of men who thought they had claimed her fate. She knew better. Power, she realized, was not granted by vows or crowns. It lived in perception. She whispered a prayer, not to God, but to memory. Let them write what they will, she thought. I will turn their words into armor. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a silence so pure it felt like renewal. By dawn, the curtains were closed, the witnesses gone, and a legend had been born. The world would remember her as both sinner and saint, pawn and queen. But that night, under the cold gaze of Ferrara's candles, Lucrezia Borgia had discovered the only truth that mattered. Control was the purest form of survival. And from that moment, every whisper that carried her name only made her stronger. When morning broke over the frozen fields, Ferrara awoke to a new kind of power, soft-spoken, veiled in silk, and infinitely more dangerous than any sword. By the time dawn painted Ferrara's rooftops gold, the city already buzzed with rumor. Servants whispered that the Borgia bride had tamed her husband. Courtiers repeated it with envy, and clerics with alarm. Yet the truth was subtler and more dangerous. Lucrezia Borgia had not been tamed. She had begun to rule, not through decree or sword, but through the delicate mastery of perception. Days after her wedding, Ferrara transformed into a stage of silent appraisal. Nobles watched from balconies as she passed, searching for arrogance, for weakness, for evidence of the infamy Rome had promised. Instead, they found restraint, a woman whose composure was armor. She walks, one chronicler wrote, as though she listens to the air for treachery. But behind her quiet grace smoldered something sharper, a fire she had carried from the Vatican itself. Her education had not been in prayer, but in survival. Within the corridors of Rome, she had learned the art of diplomacy disguised as obedience. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, moved nations like chess pieces. Her brother Cesare drew his maps with blood. From them, she had inherited neither cruelty nor faith, but calculation. In their world, mercy was a lie and affection a liability. She had watched men die smiling at her and learned to smile back, memorizing every deceit. Ferrara's court was no sanctuary. It shimmered with learning and refinement, but beneath its gilded civility lay suspicion. Alfonso's sister, Isabella d'Este, glittered with grace and venom alike. She viewed the Pope's daughter as an interloper, a rival to her intellect and influence. And so, from the moment Lucrezia arrived, the palace became a maze of listening doors and hidden letters. Alliances whispered through silk fans. Betrayals were poured as wine. At first, Lucrezia played the role expected of her. She presided over feasts, offered blessings, and smiled at those who hoped to see her falter. Yet behind her calm, the ink never dried. In secret, she wrote letters in cipher, dispatching them to Rome and Florence, each line a thread in an invisible web. Her hand was steady, her code precise. What others mistook for passivity was patience, the kind of patience that eventually reshapes power itself. It was during this time that the legend of her ring began. A delicate gold band, set with a hollow compartment, its purpose the subject of endless gossip. Some claimed it carried perfume, others poison. No proof was ever found, but Lucrezia never corrected them. Fear, she understood, was more useful than denial. Let them imagine her dangerous. It kept their daggers sheathed. Her husband, Alfonso, watched her closely. He had married her for politics, but in her silence he recognized strength akin to his own. He was a man of iron and fire, a maker of artillery, while she forged influence from words and glances. In council, he began to ask her counsel. She answered softly, logically, without emotion, and her clarity unsettled the room. "If you wish to end a feud," she once advised, "do not silence your enemy. Teach him to depend on you." Alfonso never forgot it. Even Isabella began to waver. The Duchess of Mantua, accustomed to adoration, found herself haunted by the very calm she despised. Her letters dripped with civility laced in venom. "The Pope's daughter smiles too easily," she wrote. "One might think she knows how this will all end." She could not see that Lucrezia already did. Beyond the court's glitter, plague came. Ferrara's nobles fled to their estates, leaving the city to its fate. Lucrezia stayed. She opened the palace to the sick, moving among them with unflinching grace. It was not piety that drove her, but authority. Compassion, publicly wielded, became dominion. When the bells tolled for the dead, her name was spoken with reverence. The serpent had learned to shed her skin and emerge as saint. Power, like heat, radiated silently. Alfonso's trust deepened. Foreign envoys began to write of her as the Duchess who governs without decree. Her correspondence grew, her influence widening beyond Ferrara's walls. She played courts against one another, crafting a balance between Rome and Venice that neither could detect. When Pope Alexander died and the Borgia's empire began to crumble, Ferrara remained untouched, shielded by a woman everyone still underestimated. In public, she was serenity incarnate. In private, her candle burned late into the night, ink staining her fingers like blood. She read reports, adjusted her messages, and wove truth into illusion. It was not affection she sought, nor vengeance. It was autonomy, the rarest treasure granted to any woman of her age. One evening, Isabella confronted her during a banquet, her smile tight. "You have brought Rome's shadows to Ferrara," she said sweetly. Lucrezia only raised her cup. "Then perhaps Ferrara needed shade," she replied. The laughter that followed was polite, but beneath it, alliances shifted like sand. By the time winter returned, the city had accepted her not as a guest, but as its pulse. Painters sought her patronage, scholars her conversation, and nobles her favor. She had turned the weapons once used against her, rumor, beauty, silence, into instruments of command. What began as survival had become strategy. What began as marriage had become dominion. And yet, at night, when the revels quieted and the snow muffled the courtyards, she would walk alone through the palace chapel. There, in the flicker of votive light, she faced the one opponent she could not outwit: memory. The faces of the fallen flickered before her: father, brother, lover. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Forgive me, or remember me, but do not forget." Outside, Ferrara slept beneath a sky rimmed with frost. Inside, a woman who had learned to breathe fire stood in silence, her shadow stretching long across the marble floor. The warmth she carried was no longer the fire of youth, but of mastery, the steady, consuming kind that reshapes iron into gold. Dawn came quietly to Ferrara, uncoiling through shutters and along marble floors like the breath of something newly born. The bells had not yet rung, and yet the air itself seemed aware that history had shifted in the night. Beyond the river's mist, the banners of the Este family stirred, heavy with dew and promise. Lucrezia stood by the window, watching the first light gild the rooftops. She did not smile. Triumph, she had learned, was never the end of a story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The city awoke to ceremony. Trumpets blared, heralds announced treaties signed and debts forgiven. Messengers galloped between courts carrying news that the alliance between Rome and Ferrara now stood unbroken. On parchment it looked like victory. But beneath the ink lay something quieter, an understanding not written yet binding. Lucrezia's influence, once whispered about in salons and cloisters, had become institutional. Every favor granted by Alfonso, every decree issued in Ferrara's name, carried her invisible seal. She had learned to rule from behind the arras, through silence more potent than decree. Her days unfolded like ritual. Morning councils in the library, where sunlight fell in latticed patterns over maps and manuscripts. Afternoon processions through the markets, her presence softening taxes and tempers alike. At dusk, the private meetings, letters sealed in wax exchanged by hands that trembled with ambition. But the real theater began at night. When the candles burned low, Ferrara's nobles gathered to whisper. They spoke of the Duchess's beauty, her composure, her impossible reach. Some praised her, others feared her. None understood her. One chronicler, writing for the Pope's successor, described her thus: "She commands with silence, and her silence weighs more than 1,000 swords." It was not intended as flattery. Rome had begun to resent what it could no longer control. After her father's death, the Borgia name became poison, yet in Ferrara it bloomed anew. She had turned infamy into elegance, scandal into currency. That was her alchemy. But empires built on whispers are never quiet for long. Within the court, a new enemy took shape. Isabella d'Este, ever watchful, ever envious, had not forgiven Ferrara's acceptance of its new duchess. Through letters and envoys, she sought to expose Lucrezia's supposed manipulations. Each rumor was crafted like a blade, designed to pierce not flesh but legacy. Lucrezia countered them the only way she knew, with grace so measured it became menace. When accused of overstepping her husband's authority, she simply smiled and said, "A wife who obeys too well endangers her lord, for obedience breeds dependency." The courtiers gasped, but Alfonso only watched her with something between awe and caution. He knew she spoke not of rebellion, but of protection. Their bond was no longer political, it was symbiotic, forged in trust and tempered by strategy. Together, they ruled a realm that had learned to mistake harmony for weakness. Beyond Ferrara, Europe convulsed. France invaded Milan, Spain schemed in Naples, and Rome reeled beneath the weight of its own corruption. Yet within her walls, Lucrezia maintained a fragile stillness. She negotiated truces through letters written in cipher and sealed with perfume. She arranged marriages, brokered peace, and dictated the tempo of war without ever leaving her chamber. If kings wielded armies, she wielded rumor, and rumor obeyed her. Still, the shadows lengthened. Chroniclers began erasing her from their accounts, attributing her victories to Alfonso, her policies to male advisers. The same men who once feared her now pretended she had never mattered. It was the most insidious betrayal of all, to survive in memory only as ornament. But Lucrezia, ever perceptive, understood this game too. She began to shape her own mythology. She commissioned portraits that softened her features, poems that sanctified her virtue. The woman who had once been called a poisoner now appeared as a Madonna. Image became her final empire. And yet, in the privacy of her study, she still wrote in cipher. "They will remember me as they need to," one fragment reads, "but the truth belongs to those who listen closely." The line, later found in a burned letter, outlived every scandal attached to her name. Even her enemies could not deny her intellect. They simply feared what it revealed, that power, when wielded without permission, terrifies the world more than sin ever could. Years later, when the Vatican's spies finally reached Ferrara, they found no evidence of her schemes, only a woman in mourning black, tending to her children and her books. She received them with courtesy, her voice soft as confession. "Tell Rome," she said, "that peace is not bought with war, but with perception." They left uneasy, unsure whether they had been blessed or warned. Her influence lingered long after. Ferrara flourished under her guidance, its artists, its poets, its balance between intellect and intrigue. The city became a mirror of her own philosophy, poised, beautiful, and never entirely safe. Even after her death, her letters continued to surface. Dispatches to princes, to diplomats, to unnamed women scattered across Europe. Each carried the same message disguised as counsel. To be seen is to be shaped. To be unseen is to endure. Centuries would recast her as saint, sinner, courtesan, or conspirator, but none would capture the truth. She had built an empire on a whisper, on the fragile power of suggestion and restraint. Where others carved monuments, she left echoes. Where others sought dominion, she created continuity. And in the final quiet of that dawn, as the bells of Ferrara tolled again, a servant found her standing once more by the window, her face turned toward the light. The city lay beneath her like an obedient secret. For the first time in years, she smiled. The world beyond her walls might forget her name, but every woman who learned to navigate power with patience would carry her legacy unknowingly. Outside, the wind rose, carrying faint echoes through the courtyards, words indistinguishable, but resolute. Perhaps it was only the bells, or perhaps it was the sound of history whispering back.